the cars, passed each other on the highway there on the road going over the bridge. And that's when they saw opportunity. And I can't say for sure who instigated the fight, but they were in a war. After Pellegrino Scalia was killed, they were in a war. So first opportunity that they had to fight it out, they went for it.
The legends of the American Mafia are woven into the fabric of American society and pop culture. We've all seen the movies or heard the stories of the men of this secret society. They are stories of family, power, wealth, respect, greed, betrayal, violence, murder, and mayhem. While the golden age of the mob may be over, the stories have become lore, and the names remain as infamous as ever. You're listening to the Members Only Podcast, hosted by history buff and mob aficionado Jacob Stoops. He tells the true crime biographies of real-life mobsters and dives deep into the plots, subplots, and real facts behind Cosa Nostra, as well as popular mob films and television shows. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Members Only Podcast. I am your host, Jacob Stoops, and I'm a mob enthusiast and historian. In today's episode, we're going to do our first ever interview. I'm really excited about it, and I've decided that it's time to change things up a little bit, and I'll give you a few of the reasons real quick before we jump into the interview itself. First, my goal is to document the real history of the mafia in America, and I've kind of come to the decision that you can't really do that without hearing directly from the people who either lived it or who were closely connected to it. I waffled for a really long time, and I apologize to those people that have reached out for me asking to do an interview that I've just not responded to. And that's primarily because I was waffling on whether or not I wanted to do interviews on this podcast. But in the end, it came down really to my desire to document the history, and that means talking to people. I kind of see each episode as kind of like an investment, right? As a way to put together a mosaic of the life. And my ultimate goal is that each episode will ultimately blend together to form a larger picture of the history of Cosa Nostra in America. Now, secondly, I fully realize that my episode production is way slower than many other channels. And don't worry, I still plan to bring you the same types of episodes I have thus far with the same painstaking amount of detail. But interviews and other types of content will allow me to kind of fill the gaps, so to speak, while I'm researching and putting together the more biographical or documentary style episodes. I am and always will be incredibly thorough with the way I research and piece together episodes, but that takes a really long time. For example, the Small Dome episode probably took well over 100 hours before I stopped counting. As a result, shifting towards interview style content will really help me balance and provide more from a quantity standpoint, and they are far faster to produce. And this is all in order to give you a more consistent flow of content while still allowing me time to do the background digging that you've become accustomed to. And lastly, I've been interested in this genre for a long time before deciding to create a podcast, and I've never really actually had any direct connections. Like I've said before, I'm just a small town nobody who happens to be fascinated by the mob, loves mob movies, and has had a love for history for essentially my entire life. But that all, you put that all together and you've got this podcast. And I believe that making connections and hearing other voices, especially those who are a lot closer to the life than myself, really lends more authenticity to the information I'm sharing on a regular basis. So I've got a list of people that I'd love to interview and who I plan to reach out to, but I'm also looking for non-traditional interview ideas. And just like my episodes, my goal is a little different than most podcasts. Now, generally speaking, while I'm open to talking to anyone, I'd like to really focus on little known stories or instances of regular people running up against the mob, living side by side with the mob, growing up with or near the mob. And this means that I won't be talking to the folks who are the most popular or well known within the current ecosystem of mafia YouTube. And I think you all know who those typical people that you see get interviewed or the kind of regular talking heads are. In fact, some of the people I hope to interview will be just regular people like myself who nobody has heard of. And if this is you, I'd be interested in hearing your story. So please email me at membersonlypodcastshow@gmail.com, and we'll talk and see if your story is the right fit for an interview on this podcast. And now, without further ado, we've got a really amazing guest lined up. So let's get to the interview. Hey everybody, this is Jacob Stoops, host of the Members Only podcast, and as I will have said in my introduction, we're trying something new here on the podcast, and we are going to begin to get into interviews. I know that I take a long time to put out episodes, but it's primarily because the content that I put out, I don't put it out unless I feel confident that I've done a high degree of journalistic rigor on it. Therefore, it means that it takes me weeks and sometimes months. And I feel like integrating some new content into the podcast would be a good thing to mix it up for my audience, and a good thing to make sure that I'm continually producing content. So with that being said, everybody knows, if you've watched my recent episodes, I've been, I'll just say, in a Colorado mob rabbit hole, which I promise I will come out of at some point. But in doing my research, I came across a fairly interesting person who is here with me, and fairly paramount to a lot of the history that I was able to kind of dig up about the Colorado mob and how it kind of started. So with me today is Sam Carlino. Sam, I'll allow you to kind of, give your background and explain to the audience how you fit into the Colorado mob history and lore, and kind of who you are and your background.
Hey, thanks, Jacob. Well, my grandfather was Pete Carlino, and as you know, he was pretty much an infamous figure in Colorado bootlegging lore, first mafia family, really. He had 4 brothers. Unfortunately, they all perished by gunshot, if you can believe that. So Pete, Sam, Carlo, and Stefano were all instrumental in, right after the induction of the Bone Dry Act in 1916, with bringing prohibition, bringing bootlegging and illicit alcohol to the Colorado region, and that's he's a fixture, in Colorado mafia history.
Yeah, the interesting thing, as I was doing my research, that I did not realize that when you think of immigration, you think of the big East Coast port hub cities, the New York, Boston, I guess even Chicago. If you get into the Midwest, really the last place I would have thought about was Colorado being a hive for Italian immigration. And I think my research indicated that, in the early 1900s, something like 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5, I can't remember the exact number, people living in Colorado were of Italian descent. and your grandfather and great uncle came over. And maybe you can fill in some of the gaps for me. I believe they came from Agrigento. I don't know if that's mainland Italy.
They come from the town of Lucca Sicula,
Okay.
and small town in Agrigento province. Yep. It came, my great grandmother's family came here in 1888, the Regios, and then the Carlinos settled in 1897, while the Regios were in New Orleans until 1897. When the Carlinos arrived, they made the trek to Pueblo, Colorado, and that area, that region. They bounced around from a lot of little towns between Walsenburg and Pueblo and Sugar City and Trinidad. So they were in a lot of different areas. Just after the turn of the century, all the way up to 1920, they probably moved 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, and one of the other interesting things is Colorado. So if you think about one of the big propellers, I should say, of gangsterism, the mafia, is of course prohibition. And I've talked about that quite often on my podcast. That was the singular event that propelled a lot of people, not just of Italian descent, but to be able to flip the class system that was in place. And of course, I feel like classes are ruled by money. And that was a way for a lot of young Italians at the time to find a way to make money really, really, really quickly. And with money, you can do the things that get you power. And what I didn't know was that Colorado went dry a full 3 to 4 years before the rest of the country. So I feel like your grandfather and your uncles got a bit of a head start on everybody.
Well, they did. They had a 4-year head start on Prohibition. But what was interesting, most Sicilians before 1916, a lot of prominent Sicilians were gangsters were using the Black Hand to get money out of other Italians. And it wasn't until about 1915 or so when they made sending letters in the mail a federal crime, and the fines were pretty stiff. You're going to end up in jail for a long time. That stopped or slowed down the amount of Black Hand letters and extortion that was going on. And my great grandfather was rumored to have been part of a Black Hand scheme through a Bureau of Investigation report that was done around 1918 and 1919 that I have regarding the La Presto murders. And I can go into a little bit on that a little bit later with Mike O'Hara, because I've been working with him when he's helping me on my book, and I'm helping him on his book with research. And it goes well back, even just at the dawn of the Prohibition era in 1916 or so, when this stuff starts in Colorado.
So in 1916, and so I'm gonna gather that throughout that time period, they're doing their thing as far as the Black Hand goes. Eventually, that fizzles out in favor of the more highly organized groups. It
was much more lucrative for bootlegging.
Yeah, it was. And I think one of the interesting things is, at least from my research, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, your family had a farm. They were farmers to begin with. And once you started to see the dollar signs of prohibition, they decided to convert their farm, at which point they started making moonshine whiskey, Sugar Moon whiskey. Now, I guess what I would like to understand is, how do they go from farmers to bootleggers, and then building eventually an operation so large and significant that your grandfather becomes known as the Al Capone of Southern Colorado? Like, how does one go from point A to point B?
I think he got that reputation because, like Al Capone, he was ruthless in attaining his power. they had a run-in, started in 1922 with the Danna family, which we're actually related to. We're blood cousins. We're fourth cousins to the Dannas through DNA tests, which is amazing to me, because I didn't know that till after I wrote my book, and I was approached by Chuck Danna at the Denver Library, and he asked me if I recognized any of the names on the ancestry DNA chart with him, and my first cousin is his fourth cousin, basically, So I thought we were just related to the Dannas through marriage when the Piscopo sisters married in, to the Dannas and the Carlinos, but it wasn't. We're actually related back in Sicily. And that's what makes it even more intriguing, because for whatever reason, they were cousins. They didn't get along in Sicily. I never could find out from my dad and my uncles why. It was bad blood, but it got a couple things tipped off. Well, number one was the killing of Pellegrino Scalia in 1922. And also the Bessemer water ditch issue with John Danna. But that wasn't so much with our family. There was a water rights issue between the two farms. But what really started off the entire war between the Carlinos and the Dannas was the killing of Pellegrino Scalia.
And this is a war that, according to my research, lasted almost a decade, and lots of shooting back and forth from what I saw. And I read a statistic that from 1919 to 1933, and I'm sure we'll get into more of this, there were at least law enforcement in Denver suspected that there were about 30 gangland homicides. And I just have to say, and I don't know if you got this feeling, my feeling was that number was significantly low based on the amount of shooting that I saw back and forth in my research.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was way low.
Yeah.
Anytime that you create an environment. See, the problem with Prohibition was they had this idea of let's just outlaw alcohol, but they didn't really think it through on how they can enforce it. How much
it's very unpopular. Yeah.
How many officers and, what rights are going to be infringed, and, on and on. It was a logistical nightmare for them trying to figure out how they were going to enforce this new law. And, it's the only amendment that's ever been repealed.
Yeah. And it, you can take alcohol away, but that doesn't mean people still don't want to drink it. And when you don't have the infrastructure there and you still have a thirsty public, well, guess what's going to happen? There's going to be somebody there to supply the demand. And that's exactly what happened. So, the Carlinos, their reputation and their operation is continuing to grow. And then the war with the Dannas starts out, and Pellegrino Scalia is killed. And really, I feel like if I'm remembering it right, the shooting with the Dannas, the Carlinos took quite a bit of damage at first before they really started getting back. And I believe that in addition to Scalia, the next hit was your great uncle Carlo.
Yeah, that happened in September 10th, 1923, when Carlo was killed at the Baxter Bridge shootout. And that really just changed the whole trajectory of the war, because we were down, John Millay was killed, John Millay Sr., and a couple bodyguards and Pellegrino Scalia. And now once Pete's little brother gets killed, it just becomes a war of epic proportions. They were going to go down at the end. And these guys are, the Sicilian culture of the vendetta, it's really hard to explain to people. It's ingrained in their culture for hundreds of years. And when they swear a vendetta on somebody, it's for life.
Yeah. In the interesting thing is the shootout. I can't remember. 40 to 100 or something shots fired in the shootout. But and I was actually
Frank Messina went back and got more.
Got more, yeah. And the interesting thing that, well, one, I thought is really cool that in my research I was able to find kind of an approximate location and then go into Google Maps and try to find the spot where it had occurred, and I think I got pretty close. But a lot of the newspaper reporting made, in addition to a big deal about the shootout, your great uncle Carlo, it almost seemed like it was a bit of an execution, more than just a chance, ambush or shootout. And I don't know if that, if you found anything like that as well.
Was that the cars, passed each other on the highway there on the road going over the bridge, and that's when they saw opportunity. And I can't say for sure who instigated the fight, but they were in a war. After Pellegrino Scalia was killed, they were in a war. So first opportunity that they had to fight it out, they went for it. And they had them pinned down. It was pretty evenly matched until they went back and got reinforcements and made a call from the Danna's house. And they were able to get more men and more supplies. And then it went from like 2-on-2 to like 6-on-2, and they were just outgunned. Yeah. And the sandbar that's still there, like they said that
yeah, you can see that.
If you look at the flow of the river, and they describe it in the accounts, in the trial, and even in the newspapers about what side, who was on what side, and you could see the sandbar where Carlo floated down and his body laid resting on it. And it's still there to this day. It's crazy.
Yeah. And so if you watch my part 1 video, you can see the sandbar, I believe, in the Google Street View, which is again just really, really interesting. Not something I thought I would dig in and find. So a couple of years, and it again, they're shooting going back and forth in bodies dropping in this conflict for years. But eventually, your Uncle Pete, or I'm sorry, your grandfather Pete and your great uncle Sam catch up with the two main Danna brothers. And the way that I read it is that it was a classic gangster style hit where the Dannas are going and they're standing outside of a pool hall, and they, your grandfather and your uncles speed up in a car, leaning out the window with the Tommy gun and mow them down.
I think it was shotguns. I'm not
sure. Shotguns. Okay.
Shotguns were more of their gun of choice at that time. More forgiving. You could be off a little bit and still hit your target. And they do a lot of damage. You get the right shotgun shells, it could be really damaging. And it's interesting that they, at that time, a lot of these guys would make their own rounds. Would reload, and they would make poison bullets. They'd actually make homemade bullets by dipping the bullets in garlic, and garlic would cause a terrible infection inside the body. Even if they winged a guy, it might killing them in the long run with some sort of infection. So
yeah, and I found, and we'll talk about it towards, I think, the end of this episode, definitely found some interesting things related to your grandfather's passing and poison bullets. There were definitely indications that was what was used. So eventually this war with the Dannas ends. The Carlino brothers end up, at some point getting the last Danna brother. And
in 1926, when they kill both Danna, Sam Danna's on the run and he's no longer a threat. So they were looking for him for 4 years.
Yeah.
He never created a threat to them at all. And that 4-year period between 26 and 30 is when Pete and Sam really get the foothold in, and by 28 they're moving into Denver, and
Yep.
really becoming very powerful in that 4-year period.
Yeah, and when you move into Denver, and this is something I brought up in the Small Doan episode, at least in my opinion, controlling the mobs were definitely in Pueblo, but controlling Denver because of the sheer population was probably made you more important.
Yeah, they had a bigger marketplace.
Bigger marketplace. So getting a foothold in Denver and really owning it and consolidating your power would have been really important to controlling the overall state. And you're right, in this time, and I think it's after the killings of the two Danna brothers is when he really starts to get that nickname, and then their business, as far as I could tell, really starts to grow and boom. But also in Denver at that time, and this is going to be an important name, is a guy named Giuseppe Joe Roma starting to get a foothold. He has the occupation of grocer, but in reality, he was a gangster, diminutive, very small, tiny guy, but had a lot of power and was building a power base as well. And I think, I would love to understand what that relationship was like between the Romas organization and your grandfather and uncles.
They were working together, and all the way up until January of 31, where Roma pulled a fast one on him with the Bootleggers Convention. Actually, it was called a Bootleggers Congress.
Yep.
But the Bootleggers Convention, most people think that the undercover agent Lawrence Ballarcelli that had infiltrated the Carlino family all the way back in November of 1930, he's the one that called it in. He wasn't. I have Ballarcelli's reports, and unfortunately I got this dumped in my lap after I wrote the book, but I have them now. They're very important. And he claims that he was very upset that they broke up the Congress, the meeting at the Pomarta restaurant there, because he wanted to really find out more information about what they were doing. And he said the police really kind of blew it. But Joe Roma and the Small Doans were the strong arm of Roma, strong arm men for him. And they were absent from the meeting. Now in December and January, I have pictures of Raphael Small Doan and the two younger Small Doan boys. I think Chauncey and one I can't remember offhand, but
Clyde and Checkers were the two main ones at that time.
Yeah, so they're in a picture with our cousin Joe Petralia, who had come out from California to be Sam's bodyguard. Well, Joe Petralia gets pretty jealous when he finds out that the bodyguard is not going to be himself for Sam. It's actually going to be the new federal undercover agent, Lawrence Ballarcelli. And he's worked his way into the family, kind of like the very first Donnie Brasco.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Deal to go in with this group and to hear his accounts and to find out, because he was investigating the murder of Kearney. Dale Kearney was a prohibition agent that was killed in July of 1930. And by August, Ralph Carr put together a team of 3 agents, and these 3 agents were supposed to infiltrate the Carlino family and go down in Pueblo and Aguilar. And 2 of the guys were made in the first day. So the only one that was not made was Ballarcelli, and he's the one that actually helps bring the Carlino family down. And
I'm going to fast forward. The agent, I believe it's Baldassarelli or Baldassarri. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. He gets shot.
I don't pronounce it correctly either.
Yeah, he gets shot in 1933. So it was a hazardous occupation, and I'm a firm believer that Roma and one of Roma's henchmen were the ones that Roma was for a small guy, he was a busy and a violent guy. And I think he did the shooting in that case, or was right there doing the beating when Baldassarelli was shot a couple of years later. So the Bootleggers Convention was a really, really important event. So the Carlinos had just gone through the Danna War throughout most of the 20s. They eventually, in the early 30s, kill off the last Danna brother and finish the vendetta, so to speak. And then at about this time, when you're trying to take control of a major metropolitan area with lots of players, and this was every family in the United States having these types of issues, where lines were drawn along different groups of Italians, different ethnicities, and everybody's trying to make a buck. You're bound to bump into one another from time to time, and if you don't have alliances, well, those interactions can go pretty poorly. So the way I interpreted this Bootleggers Convention in 1931, which I believe was called by Roma, was sort of a way to cool things down before things got worse. Form partnerships. I believe there was an effort to do some price fixing, and to talk about how they were going to price alcohol.
What's interesting, reading Walter Rosselli's file and his reports, was that Sam and Pete was not even at the meeting.
Really?
Ignacio Vaccaro was representing the family at the meeting. That was Ignacio Vaccaro was our cousin, and he was the bodyguard for Pete, my grandfather, and they were at home at the time of when they broke it all up, and they arrested them at their house, and they arrested them for vagrancy, which was funny.
That was a pretty common charge.
They were in their own home, and they knock on the door, and they're getting arrested for vagrancy, and I just thought that was funny.
I see that a lot in my research. It's like, if you can't pin anything else on them, vagrancy. Yeah.
Walking down the street, and he saw the cops going to the house, so he turned around and walked back, and then he visited Sam in jail, and he said, yeah, we got pinched for this thing, and they got off within a day, though.
Who do you think dropped the dime on that meeting?
It was Roma. It was Joe Roma, and that's what Rosselli says in his report.
It's a trap.
And Joe Roma, and he was upset that the police went in and raided it. He was like, you guys could have found out a lot more information if you had not, bull rushed these guys.
Yeah, that was, I was trying to figure out all sides, and that was in the first episode of the Colorado Mob series, kind of what I speculated as well. But I also wasn't sure about the Baldessarelli connection, and it's hard to know. Shortly after this meeting gets busted, I think it's a couple of months later, Pete's house blows up. So tell us about that. Okay,
so on February 18th, Pete gets shot at on the street corner.
Yep.
And they miss him. He realizes that him and Sam are both marked men, that Roma is gunning for him now. He's running out of money. He needs to go back east and get approval, basically, to help take out a boss. So he needs to get approval back east from the higher ups, which would be Maranzano. And he plans a trip on March 3rd to go to New York. Now, Baldessarelli is responsible for driving him to Omaha. He drops him off. He writes about this in his report. And he says that's the last time that he sees Pete, is in around March 5th of 1931. Baldessarelli passes on all the information to the feds, and they follow my grandfather all the way across the country. He's being tailed the entire time he's making his trip through Milwaukee, Chicago, and all the way to Brooklyn. Now, when Baldessarelli gets back to Denver, he's part of the plot, and he's privy to all the information that's being passed on about blowing up the house. They're going to blow up Pete's house himself and make it look as if rival bootleggers had done it. And he was going to collect the insurance because he had it insured double. He had it for 2 different insurance companies. The house's value was around $5,000. So he was going to get around $11,000 in return because Sam had burned his house down in California the year before and it worked there. So they figured they'd try it again. And they didn't know that a federal undercover agent had told the police chief and the mayor that it was going to happen. And interesting that the mayor and police chief didn't stop it.
And then, so I don't want to fast forward through everything, but their demise in 1931, I would say, it was pretty sudden. It was one thing after another, and eventually they don't get to Pete first. They get to your great uncle Sam first. So he is standing, I believe. I couldn't tell exactly what room in his house, but he's standing in his house, and he's in. I'll let you describe it, but he's talking to another man, and he's assassinated. And I believe this is in around the fall of 1931 time frame. Am I right?
He was killed on May 8th, 1931.
Oh, okay.
And he was having a meeting with Bruno Moro and Jim Coletti, their cousin. And Jim Coletti was hired as his bodyguard to keep him protected. He wasn't allowed to have any guns in the house because he was out on bail. They had one gun hidden down in the basement. But he had gotten a call from Bruno Moro, who ran one of their stills, and he had been felt slighted by the Carlinos because he was expecting some extra money for a job that he got pinched on, and he didn't get reciprocated enough as much as he wanted.
He was a relatively young guy. I think at the time he was 18 or 19.
18-year-old kid, and he came in the house and they had a conversation and everything was going good. And my grandmother was there, and my great aunt was there. My grandmother left with the other Coletti bodyguard, and just as they were saying goodbye, he took a shot at Coletti, wounded him, and took a shot at Sam and actually shot him through the back, and it went into his heart, and he died pretty suddenly. So
this was more related to their personal issue than anything ordered by Roma, or do you feel like Roma was pushing this?
By Roma.
Okay.
By Roma because he had switched alliances. They found out that Bruno Moro was disgruntled, was not happy with the Carlino family, and whenever they find, when you find out about these things in a rival gang, if you can get that guy to turn, you got an end. And they weren't suspecting Bruno Moro at all. They've known him, since he was a kid. And in fact, his sister was their babysitter, their house cleaner, back in from Aguilar.
It's amazing how interconnected all of this is in terms of the familial or friend relationships. That's just something that I have found fascinating digging into this. And I know it's very similar in other cities as well. But to hear how close these people were, but then they're also murdering each other is amazing.
It's amazing.
Yeah, fascinating. It's more like it. Couple of months later, after the assassination of Sam, Pete, who is still on the run, is eventually captured and brought in, and his bond of $5,000 was paid by, guess who? Joe Roma.
Yeah, so, there's about 3 or 4 different people on the bond, but Joe Roma was definitely the most famous of them, and he had been told, so there was a newspaper report that I put in my book, first time that I tied the Maranzano connection with my grandfather together. And when my grandfather went to Brooklyn, this is what Baldarcelli talked about in his report. And he said that Pete was going back east to talk to, he didn't use him by name, but to talk to the big boss and get things squared away. When he went back out there, a ruling was made. They looked into it and they realized that my grandfather was being reckless. And they said, no, you're not going to be in power anymore, but you were going to be stripped of your power. But, he's one of the older guys. He was the same age as Maranzano.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of respect, both Sicilian. And he says, look, you're going to stay alive, but you're just not going to be able to be in power anymore.
On the shelf.
Right. So what happens after Maranzano makes that decision and basically says to Roma, hey, that you're in complete power now. This guy's going to live. Roma bails him out. He does the right thing. Well, two things happen. My grandfather starts reorganizing and starts getting, trying to really get his foot back into the game again, which he wasn't supposed to do. And number two, the most important thing is he allowed a federal undercover agent to infiltrate the family.
Yep.
And that was a big no-no. So those two big things right there is what I think precipitated, I think, Maranzano giving the okay, because this is what Nicola Gentile talks about in his book about the Maranzano murder with Luciano and Lansky and them, was that the September 10th, 11th day of the purge was actually supposed to be set to kill Luciano and Lansky and Genovese and all those other guys. Well, they turned it around on him because the Mad Dog Cole, the guy that was supposed to kill Maranzano, was actually coming up the stairs to have a meeting.
Yep.
And they saw him and he turned around and took off. They eventually killed him. But that was the guy that was going to be the button man for Luciano. So it was really interesting to see how they were, they turned the tide. So I really believe that my grandfather was on that list, that September 10th, September 11th day of purge. And it really got, it happened because he was fingered by our cousin Joe Petrolia. In fact, it's funny because Joe Petrolia's nephew still cuts my hair to this day. He's my barber for the last 55 years. I've been going to him. So he's got stories about his uncle. It's pretty interesting.
Wow. Yeah. And again, like I said, some of the familial connections that you've expressed to me are just fascinating is probably the only word that really, really comes to mind. So I think, you talked about it. Pete Carlino, your grandfather, was on the list, and 3 months later, thereabouts, after his bond was paid by Roma, he's assassinated.
Yep.
Taken, as far as I can tell, taken on a ride. And the research that I found indicated that the shooters used poison bullets, and he was killed. And I don't know if he was killed first and then put under a bridge, or killed under the bridge. But long story short,
off the road, and then they put him in their car. He was witnessed in town by several witnesses, and there was 2 cars involved. And I think they brought him out to Siloam Road and executed him, 2 in the back, 1 in the head, and back of the head. That's why his face was, it was hard to describe who he was. And then they threw him under the bridge, and we realized for 2 days nobody
found him.
So they dragged him out, and then they made a phone call to the coroner, and they made a phone call to my grandmother.
And then it was discovered. And the interesting thing here, as we kind of touched on, was this happens almost to the day, if not to the day, of the Maranzano execution. So the legend that you hear, and there have been a lot of reports that have suggested, some say it it definitely happened. Others say it did not happen. But what I'm talking about is the legendary night of the Sicilian Vespers, where Luciano and his group, in addition to assassinating Maranzano, conducted assassinations of Mustache Pete's, no pun intended, because your grandfather did have a nice mustache. But when you hear people that are on the naysayer list, they say, look, if you look at the newspapers around the time, the only gangland homicide is one in Colorado. Well, and that's your grandfather.
And there's a few others in New York, but
yeah, there's not a whole lot reported, but somewhere out in Colorado, this happened. And I wonder, was it the coincidence, or was it, truly, like you said, part of the planned purge?
So the very first scholar and writer to look into this was Umberto Nelli, and he wrote this book that basically explains that there was no purge. He did all the legwork before the internet. He had to go to all these cities. He looked up all of the obituaries and all of the newspapers and all the accounts, and he could only tie about three or four deaths that day, mostly around Brooklyn and my grandfather, but there was no purge. There was no 40 people killed, because it started off as 10 and then 20, and then another writer took it to 30. Pretty soon it's like getting up to 100. Some of these writers with making this crap up, and that infuriates me more than anything.
And then you have shows that proliferate it, and you've got really great, well done series. Like, for example, The Making of the Mob New York, excellent series. Talks about this big purge that never happened. So maybe they need to hire some fact checkers to go with their amazing cinematographers and storytellers.
I think it's really important to steer away from the more popular writers and look at some of the lesser known, like Thomas Hunt, who's writing The Informer. The Informer magazine, I think, is probably the best, but by far the best periodical that you can find on the mafia. And it covers all the hard to find bosses and all the hard to find stories and things that he's got these writers around the country that work with him that are doing the legwork. And it's amazing that what they're putting together each month or each quarter. I think he comes out with one every quarter. And I highly recommend, if you're into mafia history, look at the Informer magazine, because it really is amazing research.
Yeah, that is definitely on my list to read. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that I have gone in a different direction with my show, to focus on lesser known people, because what I have seen, you hear all the same stories, and it kind of just becomes regurgitated, a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where if one writer says it, then the next writer parrots it out, and then the next writer parrots it out. And it's a bit like the telephone game, where it becomes more and more distorted over time. Yeah. And everybody's all telling the same stories about the same potentially fictional things. So I like to take it a different direction and talk about things that, well, people don't talk about often in this genre. And I try my best. I'm not a journalist by any stretch, but I try to keep my standards of research to the old rule of journalism, which is at minimum 2 to 3 really good sources for any hard facts that you're putting forth, which is why pretty much every episode I have is chock full of newspaper articles and FBI reports and things that you have to dig to get. And I often joke with my friends that on my tombstone, it's just gonna say he was thorough. That's what they're gonna write. Anyways, back to okay, so Pete Carlino has been assassinated, and Joe Roma fills the power void completely in Denver, in Colorado. He's the guy. but he only lasts 2 years. And I did a lot of research on Roma, and let me tell you, Joe Roma in 1932 alone, that guy was a busy guy. They were law enforcement, and his enemies were on him, like flies on shit, so to speak. There was not a month that didn't go by without him getting thrown in and out of jail, or something happening relating to him, some sort of act of violence, a murder, something or other. And then eventually Roma is murdered in the front room of his house. And there were a lot of suspects at the time, but the ones that I felt like were most compelling were the subjects of my last episode, the Smaldones. The Smaldones, that being Ralph the father, Eugene Smaldone and Clyde Smaldone, were at Roma's house 2 hours before he was murdered.
Oh, Raphael was not.
Oh, he was not. I'm sorry. I read the two Smaldone brothers. I apologize. At the house,
and the two Smaldone brothers were there, but
yeah. In addition to a few other compatriots at the house asking to borrow money, approximately 2 hours before Roma is killed. And then they had ticket stubs to a movie theater around the time frame of 1:55 p.m. Roma is killed around 1:20, 1:30, something like that. But the brothers, when they eventually heard that Roma was killed, turned themselves into police, and they all differed on the actual theater that they went to, which I thought, well, one, you're seen at the house, and two, it's just really suspicious. Now, I don't know that they did it, but it was really suspicious.
I don't think you saw the movie.
Yeah. So I guess I would ask you, as somebody else who has researched this and kind of, knows the ins and outs of what was going on, like, who do you believe killed Joe Roma?
I truly think that it was the Smaldones, because they had the most to gain. You always have to look at who has the most to gain when somebody's murdered, whether it's a president or a mob boss. And, who's waiting in the wings to take over? And it was the Smaldones, and they stayed in power for another 60 years.
Yeah,
so,
they certainly did.
Yeah. So I think they were the last ones to be seen there. Nettie, his wife.
Yep.
His wife saw him. She was going to go make sauce with her mother around the corner. When she comes back, she finds him. They said he was shot 14 times. He was shot 7 times.
Yeah.
He was so small, the 38s and 45s were going right through his body.
Yep.
There was 14 holes, but there was 7 shots.
Yeah.
And he
shot
was
while playing his mandolin.
A fortress. He wasn't going to let anybody inside the house that he didn't know or trust.
Yep.
Like Bruno Moro killed Sam Carlino, on orders from Roma. It's so much easier to kill someone in the mafia when they don't know it's coming.
Yeah, that's why they I believe that's why they send the people that can get close.
Yeah.
That's why they send the people that can get close. So I guess one of the other questions I wanted to ask you is, your uncles and your uncles and your grandfather, in the grand scheme of things, when they passed away, were not that old, and left behind family. And so I guess my question would be, how was the family affected in the short term, as well as long term? I mean, obviously this is something, what are we, 90 years after the fact that you as his grandson is still, researching and learning about. So I would be interested in hearing kind of the family side of things and what happened after, they were both assassinated.
I'll start with Carlo, since he was the first one killed. A week after he died, or before he died, his daughter was born. Wow. And his daughter ended up moving with his wife to New York. And in fact, I keep in contact with his granddaughter, Karen, to this day. I just talked to her a few days ago. I'm going to be sending her some barbecue sauce out there to New York. She knew very little about her grandfather, Carlo, and she was really surprised when I gave her a book, and she was like, wow, she knew a little bit about it, but she was never told the whole truth. Sam had 5 children. He had 3 girls and 2 boys. And they moved to San Diego area right after Sam's murder because the Piscopo family lived there. And my Aunt Josie was one of the Piscopo daughters, and they lived their entire lives down in Los Angeles and San Diego area. The Pete Carlino family, which I'm a descendant from, is my dad and his brothers. They moved to San Jose, California in 1932, when basically my grandmother was given 24 hours notice to leave Colorado alive with the family because my Uncle Joe had sworn a vendetta against Roma. So, or Smaldone or whoever was, my uncle wouldn't talk about who it was. You know, it's just not something he would say. But that was the reason why they were given. And here's a 16, 17-year-old kid making this threat. And, you know, they're like, look, you have one day, 24 hours, get out of here or we're going to kill you all. And they took it serious. And that's when they moved to San Jose. In 1935, my grandmother passes away of stomach cancer. And those 6 boys are being raised on their own in San Jose. They're basically raising themselves. And my dad was raised by his 2 older brothers, my Uncle Vic and my Uncle Joe. And it's amazing that how well they did, how they turned out, because, you know, so many things could have gone wrong being orphaned at such a young age in the middle of the Depression. And all 6 boys never had a record. They did a 180-degree turn from where their father and uncles had come from. And they were all upstanding citizens. They owned businesses. They're charitable, had great families, and our legacy still lives today. And we have a respected name here in San Jose area. And you know, it all stems from my dad and his brothers.
And are you named after your great uncle?
Actually, I'm named after my dad, Salvatore.
Oh, your dad is Sam as well. Okay.
His name was Salvatore, but they called him Sammy.
Okay.
So he eventually just changed his name to Sam, but his real name was Salvatore.
And I guess I have to ask the obvious question. You know, you eventually come along, and at what point did you find out about the family business, so to speak?
So I was 18 years old. I was working at a sausage stand that I had at the San Jose flea market. And I was giving samples of sauce. I'd make sausage on Friday nights and then sell it on the weekends. And I was giving out samples, and this older gentleman, this is 1985, and this gentleman came up and sampled the sausage. I'd say he's probably at least 75 years old, so that puts him being born around 1910. And I gave him the sausage, and he goes, oh my God, this is great. He goes, I haven't had sausage this good since Time Market. And I said, well, this is the Time Market recipe, because that was our family's grocery store that we had. And he goes, are you Carlino? And I said, yeah. And he goes, who's your old man? And I said, Sam. He goes, oh, Mickey, I know your dad. He starts naming off all my uncles. He goes, and I go back with those boys. He called them boys. He goes, I remember when those boys were back in Colorado. In fact, I used to work for your grandfather. And I was like, wow, this guy worked for my grandfather. Yeah, I don't know anything about him. And I said, well, really? And he goes, in fact, I remember the day he was killed. And I go, wow. No, I think you're mistaken. I said, he died of pneumonia. And he looked at me, you know, this young kid, idiot. And he goes, pneumonia my ass. He goes, they shot him up. I go, he died of lead poisoning. And I go, really? And he goes, oh, yeah. He was Colorado's biggest bootlegger. In fact, he owned that state. And that's the one thing I'll never forget when he told me that he owned that state. And I didn't understand the gravity of it at that time. And then I asked my dad on the way home, you know, real gingerly about, you know, what year he came out. I just want to go out and ask him, you know, because he'd been keeping it quiet for a reason. I was smart enough not to just lead without leading question. And so I gave him a few little questions like what year you came to San Jose, 1932, what year did your mom die, 35, how did your mom die? She died of cancer. And your dad, how did he die again? he died of pneumonia. But eventually it got let out that, the family knew that it wasn't pneumonia, and they come clean, and they explained that they were ashamed of what they come from, what they had done, and they never talked about it. They talked about it amongst themselves. I remember at a family reunion in 1985, hearing all the San Diego cousins, all the Sam's kids, and my dad and his brothers all talking about it. But as soon as the ladies would walk up near the table, they'd stop talking about, change the subject. And I thought that was really interesting. It was their way of, I think, protecting the women in a way. I don't think they looked at it as a chauvinistic thing. I think it was more along the lines of, that we'll keep the women and children, protected, and by not letting them know about this stuff. And I was privy to it because I was, a male, and I thought it was really interesting to see that, even in '85, how they handled when the women would come around, they would stop talking about it.
And it's interesting to hear you say that they would be embarrassed, embarrassed by it, or want to, keep it a secret, keep it hidden, for fear of, having that in their familial background be some reflection on them. Once you found out that information, how did that affect you, if at all, going forward?
It didn't really change until after my dad had passed, and I had discovered some things after he died about what the stories that he had told me about getting lost in the Grand Canyon on the way over to California. And I found the road. It's called Schnebly Hill Road. It's outside of, it's south of Flagstaff, and it's near that beautiful town in south of Flagstaff. I'm can't remember it at this point, but there's a 4x4 road that they took. I remember him telling me that story about being terrified that they had this huge 1929 Dodge Senior sedan, and they were traveling on this one-lane road, and one wheel would be off the edge of the road on turns at some points, and he's staring out the window down.
God.
7-8-year-old kid. It was terrifying for him. He said that was the most terrifying thing of his life. He always remembered that. But it didn't really affect me that much until I started doing a lot more research around 2008, 2009. I started collecting photos. I found a lot of really great historic photos of our family on Historic Images on eBay. And I bought up a lot of these pictures that you see that were used in the newspapers. And I own the original copies now. And I paid like $8 or $10 a piece for them. They're all gone now. I found old newspapers, original newspapers with headlines and photos, and it just fueled my fire to look even more. One of the things that drove me to write my book was that misinformation that was out there. That's what really got me frustrated, was so much disinformation that people were writing. One guy wrote in his book, and he said that the Carlinos had an olive oil factory in Pueblo, and inside their office, he described the office to the T. Oh, they had this old rotary phone, and they had this big desk and this, and I'm like, whoa, how did this guy find out all this? I got in contact and I'm like, well, wait a minute. I got in contact with the author, and I asked him, I said, how did you find this information out about them being olive oil? I don't have any recollection of that. And I said, first of all, olives don't grow in Pueblo. It's too cold. It's very in the environment. And I said, they don't, and I said, in their office, he described their office to a T. And he goes, well, I just kind of made that up because, all mobsters are in the olive oil business.
Oh my God.
He wrote a book, and he wrote he's writing a factual true crime book, and he made that whole part up. And I just went, okay, this is ridiculous. To put that kind of information in and just make it up, just Well, because Vito Corleone had an olive oil factory, the Genco olive oil factory in The Godfather. Let's let the Carlinos have one too. That's just stupid. So that kind of stuff helped fuel my fire. Another thing I read was that in the gang war, Sam's head was cut off and put on a stake at the end of the bridge to ward off other gangs, and crap like that. It really pissed me off. So that helped fuel the fire for me to find the truth. And the more I kept digging, the more I found. And it's amazing, since I wrote the book, even more things have come, like especially the Sicily file landed in my lap when I was on my tour in Pueblo, my book tour. Absolutely amazing to find that information. And I'm going to be doing something with that in the future, but that's some amazing stuff.
So to those listening, to those watching, I'm holding up Sam's book. Tremendous read. Like I said at the end of the last video, there are a couple of books out there that if you want to really have a great understanding of the history from the early 1900s going all the way up into the 1970s, 80s, this book covers, I would call it almost part one, with respect to getting to the Small Doan era. And then of course, Dick Kreck's book on the Small Doans. Had to do a lot of supplementary research with that. Because there were a lot of things in that book that didn't get covered off on in nearly as much detail, like a man being put in a lake and weighed down while he was still alive and murdered in pretty heinous way. But anyways, both of those books are interesting. Go out and buy Sam's book. I'm going to include a link in the description of the video on YouTube. But if you're listening to the audio version, it's Colorado's Carlino Brothers, A Bootlegging Empire by Sam Carlino. So you can get it on Amazon. Pretty fair price. I believe it's priced really well. So
Jacob, I have a website, carlinobrothers.com.
There you go.
Signed copy. And it'll actually be cheaper than Amazon, and they can get it.
There you go. And it's signed. Those are better. Well, Sam, thank you so much for being my first interview. I think the interesting thing, I don't know if I told you this or not when we talked before the episode, when I was doing my research, I found a video of you giving a presentation on YouTube. And I said to myself, it'd be really cool to interview Sam one day. Seems like an interesting guy. He wrote this book that I've just read cover to cover. And lo and behold, you actually, it's maybe your ears were burning or something. And you reached out to me and we connected, and that's how this interview came together. And I'm just, happy to make the connection and happy to have had the chance to talk and to, tell your grandfather's story, because, it's really interesting. I feel like, in the mob genre, people tend to focus on Boston, New York, Chicago, New Orleans, kind of the main cities. And you don't hear about these other places, when in fact, things were just as bonkers here as everywhere else. It just didn't get the national credibility. So
they're definitely ruthless.
Definitely. Well, Sam, thank you for coming on. Is there anything that you'd like to plug before we close?
I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to come on. And again, if you get a chance, check out Thomas Hunt's The Informer magazine. And Mike O'Hara's working on a book that predates mine in the Pueblo, Aguilar, Walsenburg area, and talks about the Black Hand of Southern Colorado. And it's going to be a really well-researched book that Mike O'Hara is working on right now, and it's going to be amazing. So just I want to thank you again for the opportunity to come on and talk about this, and this has been a great opportunity. Thank you.
All right, and that's it for this episode. If you're watching on YouTube, again, I'm just going to implore you to like the video, subscribe, hit that bell for notifications. Help me feed the algorithm, get more views, grow the channel. If you're listening on the audio version, Apple Podcasts, leave me a review, leave me a rating. Tell me how you think I did, whether good, bad, or ugly. Just let me know how you think I'm doing with the podcast. But otherwise, I'm going to close like I normally close, and just thank everybody for listening.